A metal sphere hit the Atlantic like a silent meteor and vanished below 4318.9 N,827.4W. I'm a maritime incident analyst. My job is logs, not legends. 3 weeks later, the same cold lights rose from the seabed, knocking ships off AIS. In 72 hours, they'll reach the harbor. If I report it, they'll hunt it. If I don't, people die. I'm already late. My name is Nolan Varga. I work for the Coastal Navigation Safety Office as an incident analyst. I reconstruct near misses from AIS tracks, VDR excerpts, radar plots, and buoy telemetry. Most weeks, my world is timestamps and error budgets. On 412 UTC, the night the sphere fell, a trawler called San Telmo reported a black flash above the waterline. No boom, no splash big enough for the wind running 1822 knots. The boat's AIS kept transmitting, but its GNSS position snapped 310 meters east in one update, then corrected, then snapped again. That pattern is not multipath. It's not the cheap jamming we see near marinas. It looks like a clock losing its beat. I didn't know any of that when the first complaint hit my inbox. I was in the office at Port Lirio, watching the morning traffic feed. At 6:37 UTC, 3 targets ghosted for 9 seconds. Still on radar, gone on AIS. 2 minutes later, a tug's compass swung 14 degrees and eased back. The harbor master, Inez Silva, leaned close and whispered, "Don't tell me the sea is doing this." Procedure says you start simple. I drove to Beacon 4 and opened the equipment cabinet. The backup battery read 12.6 V. The GNSS receiver was locked to 11 satellites, HDOP 0.7. The AIS transponder was healthy. Yet the diagnostic log showed 5 resets between 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock, each exactly 41 seconds apart. I clamped a meter on the feed, steady at 24.1 V. Ground strap tight, surge suppressor swapped, nothing changed. Back in the office, I pulled the raw enemy A strings. The checksum errors weren't random. They clustered in bursts of 0.8 seconds, then went quiet. My spectrum analyzer showed a faint peak at 27.6 kHs, too low for VHF, too stable for noise. I wrote it down anyway, because writing things down keeps me honest. That's when I felt the old fear I pretend I don't have. The fear of filing a report that makes me sound insane. Last year, I signed my name under an incident summary that cost a pilot his license. I was right, and I still hated myself for it. Facts only, I told myself. No stories. At 1908 UTC, the Seabed camera at Station M2 uploaded its daily clip. The frame was green-black silt at 68 meters. This time it showed 3 pale points of light, rising in a straight vertical line. They paused at 52 meters. Then they drifted south, not with the current, but against it. The camera's compass jittered, froze for 3 seconds, then recovered. In the corner, the pressure sensor briefly read 0.00 bar, an impossible value at depth. I copied the file to an encrypted drive. I did not forward it, not yet. At 22:31 UTC, I drove to the headland above Breakwater Sea, the place locals call the Knife. I brought a magnetometer, a thermal monocular, and a hydrophone. The sea was black glass. Then, about 200 meters out, 3 lights rose under the surface like someone opening a door in the deep. They held for 12 seconds. A 4th light appeared closer to shore, lined up with the service road behind the warehouses, and moved parallel to land in stop-start jumps, as if counting access points. The magnetometer jumped from 47,200 NT to 47,890 NT when the 4th light appeared. On the hydrophone, I caught a pulse train. 6 clicks, a 1.2-second pause, then 6 more, always the same spacing, like an identifier. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Not the wind. I stood there with the wind in my teeth, thinking about the right thing to do. Inez would call the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard would call someone I never get to meet, and whatever was down there would learn exactly how we respond. If you want me to keep putting these logs in the open, tap like, follow, and tell me in the comments. What makes a signal ignore the tide and check the shoreline like a survey? At 0:58 UTC, the weather buoy K-17 logged a pressure drop of 3.1 HPA in 12 minutes, the front edge of a squall line. By 3:40, the rain had turned the harbor cameras into gray static. It's the kind of night where captains lie about speed and everyone pretends it's routine. San Telmo didn't pretend. I called their skipper, Arturo Mina, at 7:05. His voice was raw from shouting over engines. "No flare, no engine noise, just a dark blink," he said. Then my plotter spun like a coin. He emailed me a photo of his backup compass. The cart had jammed at 223 degrees, needle twitching as if something was vibrating the housing. I pulled the coastal radar archive. The nearest station sits on Cape Verdun, 41 meters above sea level, rotating at 24 revolutions per minute. At 4 hours 11 minutes and 37 seconds, a small return appeared for exactly 2 sweeps, 1 second apart, then dropped into sea clutter. If it was a bird, it was traveling 480 knots into the wind. If it was a drone, it had no transponder and no right to be there. At 4 hours 12 minutes and 9 seconds, the hydrophone array we use for prop noise surveys picked up a single broadband impulse. It wasn't a whale breach, it wasn't an explosion. The energy was concentrated below 30 hertz, like a hammer hitting a vault door underwater. The array triangulated the source within 90 meters of the coordinates in my hook. I unrolled the latest bathymetry. Depth at that point is 312 meters, soft sediment over fractured rock. No wrecks recorded, no pipelines. One fiber optic cable runs 1.6 nautical miles north, feeding the harbor's pilotage network. I did what policy requires. I drafted an initial hazard bulletin with unexplained GNSS disturbances and sent it to my supervisor. He replied in 4 words, "Do not circulate further." That answer should have been a relief. Instead, it made my stomach hollow. Someone else already knew. Someone else already decided. At 10:22, I borrowed a portable magnetometer from the university lab and took readings along the breakwater. Baseline 47,190 NT, variations of 512 NT, normal for this geology. Then I reached the ladder at Pier 9 and the needle surged 640 NT in under a second. The spike lasted exactly 41 seconds. That afternoon, I bought a cheap fishing sonar from a marine shop and mounted it on a rental skiff. Ridiculous, yes. But it let me see one thing the big systems average out: the water column. At 1806, right over the drop, the display painted a hard, clean arc at 298 meters. Not bottom, something hovering above it. I ran a second receiver beside the plotter, a survey-grade GNSS puck I keep for calibrations. It should have agreed within a meter. Instead, the two solutions diverged by 176 meters, then 202, then snapped back as if a hand had flicked a switch. The skiff's compass swung 9 degrees every time the clicks repeated. I dropped a weighted line with a stainless shackle and a temperature probe. Surface temp was 13.8 C. At 240 meters, the reading spiked to 18.4 C for 3 seconds, then went dead. When I hauled the line up, the shackle was warm and coated in fine gray grit that clung to my magnet. At 1814, my VHF crackled with a transmission on no channel I recognized, a thin tone carrying a single word in Spanish: Vuelva. Go back. Half a mile east, a rigid hull boat sat in the chop with no running lights. I never saw it approach. I aimed my bow towards shore. The moment I turned, the hard arc on the sonar sank, as if it had decided I wasn't worth following. The clicks changed. 6, pause, 6, then a longer burst, like a question. My engine coughed once, RPM dropping from 3,200 to 700, then recovered. When I reached the marina, an envelope sat under my wiper. Inside was a printed map of my track line and a note in block letters: "Stop logging." I pocketed the note and told no one. That night I slept in chair, shoes on, waiting for the next reset. The arc rose to 280, then 260. Slow, steady, like ballast being trimmed. I cut the throttle and listened. Through the hull came those same 6 clicks, the 1.2 second pause, and 6 more. Closer now, and not from below. Something else was moving under the boat. For 17 days after the drop, nothing dramatic happened. That was the worst part. The harbor kept working, ferries kept running, and my own brain tried to file the sphere under stress and coincidence. Meanwhile, the resets kept ticking. Beacon 4, every 41 seconds, exactly 5 times, always between 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock UTC. I built a spreadsheet that felt like a confession. Column A, time. Column B, magnetic deviation at Pier 9. Column C, AIS dropouts longer than 5 seconds. Column D, the 6-click pulses on the hydrophone. The pattern wasn't random. It migrated along the coast in clean segments of 2.4 nautical miles, night after night, like someone moving a ruler. On day 18, a fishing charter, Blue Moth, called in a mayday without knowing it. Their captain thought his engine was failing. What actually failed was their navigation. His plotter placed him inside the breakwater while he was still in open water. He turned hard to avoid rocks that weren't there and nearly T-boned a container feeder at 7 knots. I reconstructed the track later and saw the signature again. A 200-meter lateral jump, then a correction, then another jump. The feeder's pilot filed it as crew. That lie tasted like blood. Earlier that day, my supervisor scheduled a wellness check. He slid my draft hazard bulletin across the desk and tapped the header. "This doesn't leave our unit," he said. "No threat, just a man repeating someone else's script." "Why?" I asked. He looked past me at the cranes and the gray mouth of the sea. "Because it becomes a spectacle. And because if you're wrong, you'll be the one they break to prove it." Then, quieter, "If you're right, you'll still be the one they break." After that, every normal report felt contaminated. I started copying everything. Radar sweeps, hydrophone files, screenshots of AIS tracks, anything that could vanish with one phone call. Setting up on Sable Point was a risk I couldn't justify. The beach is patrolled, cameras posted. I timed my arrival between rounds and kept my head down like an amateur stargazer. When I planted the reference marker, RTK felt like a prayer. Satellites and corrections that don't care what you believe. So when I saw the figure above me, jacket with a reflective stripe that didn't match any local service, I knew I'd been seen. He didn't shout or approach. He simply watched the same dark water I was watching. The moment the lights cut, he lifted his phone. My own screen stayed black. At 21:10, I drove south to a public beach called Sable Point, where the coast road runs within 30 meters of the water. I set up 2 cameras, one visible, one IR, both with their internal clocks synchronized to GPS. I planted a reference marker in the sand and logged its exact position with RTK, 4312.004, N,831.771W. Then I waited. At 22:47, the sea lit from below. Not in one bloom, but in steps. A pale bar appeared at 6 meters depth, then slid closer until it was directly under the high tide line. The IR camera showed nothing on the surface. No foam, no disturbance. Yet my thermal monocular registered a cold streak, 1.6 C lower than surrounding water, moving like a slow scanning head. I walked down to the edge with my boots sinking. The pulse train clicked in my headphones. 6 clicks. Pause. 6 clicks. Each time the clicks ended, the pale bar shifted exactly 10 meters east. Then 10 meters again. Then again. Stop. Move. Stop. Move. Like counting. My phone lost signal. My watch tried to reboot. I told myself to step back, to be the professional I claim I am. Instead, I crouched and dragged my hand through the surf. The water around my fingers went numb. Not cold, numb, like anesthetic. For one instant, under the thin sheet of a receding wave, I saw a smooth metallic curve pass beneath the sand as if the beach itself had become transparent. Then the lights cut out. I turned to run and saw someone else standing above me on the promenade, watching the dark water through binoculars. Binoculars steady on me alone. And they were already dialing a number. The van was gone when I returned at 6 o'clock. So were my cameras. The reference marker I'd planted in the sand lay snapped in half, neatly placed on top of the trash bin like a message. "We can touch your evidence without touching you." I filed a theft report anyway. The officer took my statement, wrote electronics, and asked if I had enemies. I almost laughed. I said, "Not that I know of." He gave me a look that said, "You're lying, or you're naive." At 13:20, Inez Silva ordered a calibration run in the outer channel. "If the pilots can't trust AIS, they won't move ships," she said. We took her launch, Lirio 2, out past the breakwater with a portable DGPS beacon and my survey receiver. Officially, this was routine verification. In my bag, taped inside a dry case, was the hydrophone and a handheld pinger that emits a 20 kHz pulse, loud enough to be heard on instruments, quiet enough not to alarm fishermen. At 14:07 over the drop, I engaged the pinger for 5 seconds. The return came back not as a reflection, but as a repetition. Same pulse shape, same 5-second duration, delayed by 0.42 seconds, too short for bottom bounce at 312 meters, too clean to be a vessel. Ina stared at my screen. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means something heard us," I said, and hated myself for the sentence. We ran the track again. On the second pass, the delay changed to 0.39 seconds, as if the source had moved closer by roughly 20 meters. The magnetometer on deck, a simple flux gate, began to oscillate plus 90 NT in a steady wave, peak every 41 seconds. Then the water to port brightened. Not on the surface, under it, a line of cold light rose from 60 meters to 10, like a runway being switched on in stages. It paralleled our course and held exact station relative to the shoreline, ignoring the tide that should have pushed any bioluminescence west. The helmsman muttered a prayer. I felt my own throat lock. The professional part of me wanted to log, timestamp, quantify. The human part wanted to go home and never look at the sea again. Our AIS blinked out for 11 seconds. Radar still painted us. I watched our own target icon drift 240 meters south on the electronic chart and then snap back. If a tanker had been coming in, that glitch would have been fatal. Inez grabbed the microphone. Coast Guard Lirio, this is Harbor Launch. Lirio 2 requesting immediate assistance in Outer Channel, navigation interference, unknown source. The reply came instantly, too instantly. Lirio 2, negative. Return to harbor. Maintain radio silence. Inez went pale. That wasn't our Coast Guard, she whispered. We were making 12.4 knots when the interference hit hard. The launch's autopilot dropped with an alarm and the helm went heavy. The GPS repeater rolled through zeros, then a latitude that belonged on another continent, then snapped back. I switched to the DGPS beacon feed. It flickered, then went dark. Inez ordered speed down to 7 knots and had me call bearings with a handheld compass. The needle spun, slowed, and spun again, always settling 20 degrees wrong. At 1419, the line of undersea lights split into 5 points, each point rising about a meter per second. They stopped just below keel depth and held there. The fluxgate wave tightened, peak every 20 seconds, and my pinger began to echo itself without me touching the button. It was answering in my pocket. I recorded everything, raw NMEA, audio, a shaky video through the water. Then my phone shut off at 64% battery with no warning. Inez's tablet did the same. The helmsman's watch rebooted to January 1st, 2000. When we crossed the breakwater line, the lights sank in unison like a curtain lowering. The fluxgate steadied. Our instruments remembered how to behave. Back at the dock, a man in a gray raincoat waited beside the fuel pump. He smiled like we were late. Too late. Captain Silva, he said. Mr. Varga, hand over the recordings. On my headset, beneath the static, the 6 clicks repeated, then changed into a longer pattern, like steps approaching. And the lights began to turn toward the breakwater. The man in the gray raincoat never gave a name. He didn't need one. He stood between Inez and the gangway like a quiet barrier and spoke as if the port already belonged to him. I can't hand you evidence without a request in writing, Inez said, voice steady but thin. He nodded, as if she'd answered a question he wasn't asking. Then don't. But understand, if you upload anything to the network, it will be intercepted. If you call anyone outside your chain, the harbor closes. Pilots stand down. Ferries stop. You'll be the face on the news. Inez turned to me. I saw the calculation behind her eyes. Lives, economy, her own career, all balanced on a sentence. I wanted to tell her to refuse, to fight. Instead, I said, let me make a copy for internal analysis. It was a coward's compromise. It bought time. In my office, I ran the recordings through the tools I trust. I parsed the raw NMEA to isolate the spoofing bursts. Each burst lasted 0.8 seconds, repeating in packets of 41 seconds. The frequency peak at 27.6 kHz was still there, but now it had harmonics at 55.2 and 82.8 kHz, as if the source was modulating its own field. I compared the pulses to known catalogs, beaked whales, shipping sonars, seismic surveys. Nothing matched the 6-click signature. The clicks were too regular, 0.14 seconds apart, and the pause was always 1.2 seconds, never drifting. Nature drifts. Then I checked something I'd avoided, the official server logs. At 3:02 that morning, someone had accessed Beacon 4's diagnostics remotely using my credentials. At 3:03, the last 24 hours of reset records were deleted. At 3:04, my password was changed. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. The anger came last, behind the fear and the shame. If they could wear my name like a mask, they could do anything and hand me the bill. I printed the audit trail and put it in a folder with no label. I copied the launch recordings to 3 drives and hid them in 3 different places. One in my locker, one taped under my desk, one buried in a bag of rock salt in my kitchen. I felt ridiculous, like a paranoid man in a cheap thriller. But the van at Sable Point had been real. The Raincoat Man had been real. At 1750, I went back to Pier 9 with a handheld spectrometer. The 27.6 kHz peak was stronger, minus 42 dBm instead of minus 61. It rose and fell like breathing. When it peaked, every LED streetlight along the quay flickered once in perfect sync, and I heard a muffled thud from under the planks, like a fist tapping wood. The sea was pushing its presence up through our infrastructure. I called Inez and told her the truth. Someone had used my credentials. Someone was shaping the story. She was silent for a long time. Then she said, "Nolan, the Raincoat Man is still here. And he just asked for you by full name." When I walked to the administration building, 2 guards I didn't recognize were already at the door. Their radios were on a private talk group, not the port channel. They let me through without a word. That was worse than a stop. The Raincoat Man waited in Inez's conference room with a paper cup of coffee, like he'd been there a while. He set a device on the table, deck of cards size, with one LED that blinked every 41 seconds. He watched my eyes go to it. "You see the rhythm," he said. "Good. What do you want?" I asked. "To keep commerce moving." He slid photos across the table. "Sable Point, my snapped marker, my skiff track. Your private measurements create variables." "I'm preventing an accident," I said. He leaned in. "Accidents are manageable. Panic isn't. Hand us your copies and go back to boring reports, or keep digging and the next ship that loses position will have your name on the inquiry." I looked at Inez. Her jaw was clenched, but she didn't speak. As he left, he nodded toward the water. "It's not random," he said. "It's checking edges, like an animal testing fence lines." Right on cue, his LED blinked, and every light on the key flickered with it. I hated him for it. Outside my window, the harbor water began to glow again. By the second week of lights, people began to invent explanations so they could sleep. Fishermen blamed military exercises. Taxi drivers blamed solar storms. A local radio host blamed tourists with drones. The Port Authority issued a bland notice about temporary GNSS anomalies and advised manual navigation, as if we still lived in the age of sextants. The Raincoat Man remained, invisible in paperwork but present in hallways. After our meeting, my supervisor stopped meeting my eyes. My credentials were restored with a new password I didn't choose. Every time I logged in, I felt like I was borrowing my own hands. At 1:40 UTC, I returned to the knife headland with better gear, a calibrated Fluxgate magnetometer, a spare phone sealed in a Faraday pouch, and a handheld LiDAR rangefinder to measure the surf line. Wind 11 knots, sea state 2. The tide was rising at 0.6 meters per hour. At 2:03, the first light appeared, not offshore this time, but directly beneath the shallows. It slid along the coast in 10-meter steps, pausing exactly 1.2 seconds between moves. The 6-click pulses matched the pauses like a metronome. I spoke aloud without meaning to. "You're mapping," I said, and the words vanished into wind. When the light reached the small concrete stair that leads down from the promenade, my Fluxgate jumped 720 NT. The LiDAR picked up something stranger. The wet sand where the light paused reflected back a clean, sharp return, as if a smooth surface lay just under a thin skin of water. I went down the steps. The rational part of me screamed that this was how people disappear. The stubborn part, whatever makes me copy files to secret folders, kept moving. I dropped a steel washer tied to line into the illuminated shallows. It didn't sink. It hovered, vibrating, held in place by something I couldn't see. The water around my hand went numb again. Not cold, numb, like anesthetic. My fingertips tingled up to the wrist. For a second, the surf peeled back and I saw it. A curve of metal under the sand, perfectly smooth, reflecting the light it made. Then, the metal moved. Not up, sideways. Like something repositioning beneath a carpet. A wave slapped my knees and I lost my footing. When I caught myself on the rail, the numbness climbed into my forearm and my muscles refused to obey for 2 heartbeats. I stumbled back up the stairs, gasping, ashamed of how fast fear can turn an adult into a child. Behind me, the light reached the next stairway, then the next, stepping along the beach toward the harbor mouth. It was tracing every access point to land. I forced my fingers to work long enough to pull the spare phone from the Faraday pouch and start recording. The video is awful. Darkness, wind noise, a pale bar of light that doesn't belong, but the timestamps are clean. 2 hours, 3 minutes, and 17 seconds first appearance. 2 hours, 4 minutes, and 29 seconds first shift. 2 hours, 5 minutes, and 41 seconds Fluxgate peak. In the audio track, the 6 clicks sit like a fingerprint. The washer came with me. When the light moved on, it dropped as if gravity had been turned back on. I scooped it up and nearly dropped it again, hot like it had been on a radiator. Back on the headland, I held it near the sensor. The field around it pulsed, rising and falling every 41 seconds for almost 5 minutes before it faded. My left hand kept tingling as I drove. By 3:30, the numbness had become pins and needles to my elbow, and my grip felt wrong. I stopped at an all-night clinic and told the doctor I'd been shocked by a dock light. He offered an incident report. I refused. At 5:10, I mapped the steps onto a satellite image. 10 meters, pause. 10 meters, pause. Each pause happened at a stair, a ramp, a storm drain outlet, a boat launch, a checklist. I wrote one line in my log: "It knows where we touch the water." At dawn, I heard the clicks through the apartment wall, like tapping from below street level. 6, pause, 6. My hand tingled with them. I checked the time. 6 o'clock. Beacon 4 would reset in 2 minutes. Again, and the raincoat man's van rolled slowly along the road above headlights off, matching its pace. At 8:15, my supervisor called me into the server room. The raincoat man was there, leaning on a rack as if he owned the humming steel. 2 technicians I'd never met were plugging a black box into our switch, in line with the port's AIS feed. "It's a filter," my supervisor said too quickly, "to stabilize dropouts." The raincoat man smiled. "To stabilize narrative," he corrected, softly enough that only I heard. They took my access badge for reissuance and handed me a temporary one that opened nothing but my own office. Then they asked for my encrypted drives. I said I'd left them at home. The lie came out clean. That frightened me. Lying is a skill, and skills grow. At 11:40, I found Inez in the pilot lounge, staring at a printed tide chart like it had insulted her. "They told me to keep ferries running," she said. "They told me the lights are not interfering, if we don't provoke them." "Do you believe that?" I asked. "I believe they're afraid of something else," she said. "Not the sea. The response." At 16:05, a dockhand named Rui called my personal phone. "There's a man asking about you," he whispered. "He's walking Pier 9 with a device, like a metal detector." Before I could answer, the line went dead. When I called back, Rui's phone went straight to voicemail. I went to Pier 9 anyway, because that's what I do when fear tells me not to. The pier smelled of diesel and wet rope. The streetlights were on despite the daylight, faintly strobing once every 41 seconds. At the latter, the water below was unnaturally calm, a flat patch in a restless harbor. Rui's vest lay on the planks near the edge, folded as if he'd set it down for a minute. His ID badge was still clipped to it. No blood, no drag marks. Just a damp rectangle where someone had knelt. On the other side of the pier, a storm drain mouth opened toward the water. The concrete around it was clean, scoured, as if a pressure washer had passed. In the drain, a thin line of gray grit glittered, the same grit from my washer. My phone buzzed once. An unknown number, no caller ID. A text message appeared and vanished before I could screenshot it. Last warning. I climbed down the ladder one rung, just enough to see under the pier. The light didn't come from algae, it had edges. It traced the pilings like a scanner outlining geometry. Footsteps approached. One of the new technicians from the server room was walking the pier with a tablet clipped to his forearm. A live map glowed on it, our harbor with a moving dot pulsing every 41 seconds. The dot sat under Pier 9. He noticed me and froze. "You need to leave," he said. "Where is Rui?" I asked. He didn't answer. He spoke into his wrist radio. Not port security, not Coast Guard. When he said my name, he used first and last like a file label. I looked for traces that obey physics. Near the drain mouth, I found a crescent smear on the concrete, polished smooth as if something metal had brushed it. Embedded in the grit were tiny black pellets that snapped to my magnet and then fell away, like they were only temporarily aligned. A siren sounded from the gatehouse. Inez's voice came over the PA, forced calm. "All non-essential personnel clear the outer piers." She didn't say why. That meant she wasn't allowed. The technician stepped closer. "If you keep looking, they'll blame you when it comes up," he said, almost pleading. "What is it?" I asked. His eyes flicked to the water. "Not a boat," he whispered. Below us, the spiral tightened. The light rolled inward toward the storm drain, then paused, then rolled again. 6 clicks in my pocket, matching each pull. It felt like the harbor was being counted from underneath, pipe by pipe, exit by exit. Under the pier, the water brightened. Not in bars now, but in a slow spiral. The clicks in my pocket matched it, accelerating. 6, pause, 6. Then a new sequence, like a reply. I backed away from the edge and felt the boards vibrate under my boots, as if something heavy was moving just beneath the surface, directly towards the harbor entrance. And Rui never called again. Rui's absence became a blank space everyone stepped around. The port filed it as missing person, last seen on duty. The raincoat man filed it as nothing at all. When I asked my supervisor if he'd spoken to police, he said, "Don't make this worse," as if the sea were a rumor I could spread. I took the gray grit from Pier 9 to the university lab after hours. I used a colleague's badge, not mine. The lab was empty, lights on timers, fume hood humming. Under a microscope, the grit wasn't sand. It was flakes, thin, angular, metallic, each one layered like mica but darker. When I put a flake on a scale, it registered 0.00 G until I touched it with a magnet. Then it jumped to 0.03 G and held. Mass that depends on field orientation is not a thing my textbooks prepared me for. I ran a simple conductivity test. 1.9 ohms across 3 mm, then I heated it with a soldering iron tip at 370 C. It didn't oxidize. It didn't melt. It went temporarily transparent, like a film of oil, and for 2 seconds I could see the grid of my workbench through it as if it had become glass. I should have stopped there. Instead, I recorded it, because I'm addicted to proof. At 2:12 that night, the lights appeared 20 kilometers north off a rocky inlet called Cinder Cove. 2 boats reported their GPS placing them on land. One ran aground on a kelp shelf at 3 knots and holed its hull. No deaths, but a man broke his ankle jumping to shore. A small price, the kind that becomes a footnote, the kind that becomes a precedent. I studied the times. The shift was too fast for current, too fast for anything dragging itself along the seabed. It was as if the source could start from a new point without traveling the space between, or as if there were more than one. Inez called me at 3 o'clock. Her voice sounded older. "They're installing something at the pilot tower," she said. "That black box is no longer a filter. It's a gate. They're trying to talk back." My stomach dropped. "With what?" I asked. "With our harbor," she said. "With every transponder and light we own." I went to the pilot tower before dawn with my spare drive hidden in my boot. The technicians were there, along with the raincoat man. On the floor lay a coil of thick cable running to an antenna aimed not at the horizon, but down, towards the water. I felt a familiar choice tighten around my ribs. Hand over what I know and let them run the response, or leak the data and invite chaos. The raincoat man saw me and nodded as if we were partners. "Good," he said. "We'll need your timing." The technicians worked like the world was a machine. They bolted a rack unit under the console labeled Time Sync. Its display pulsed every 41 seconds as it fed on GPS time and the hydrophone signal. They were locking the harbor's clocks to the thing under the water. "Don't," I said before I could stop myself. The raincoat man barely smiled. "We send a handshake at the top of the cycle and see if it stabilizes the interference." "And if it doesn't?" I asked. "Then we learn," he said. "Closing the port costs more." Inez stood beside me, voice low. "If we shut down ferries, strand commuters, and hospital supplies sit offshore," she said. "I hate this, but I can't freeze a city because you're scared of a light." At 5:22, the speakers emitted the 6-click sequence, amplified clean. Then they transmitted a 20 kHz pulse train through the down-tilted antenna. For 0.42 seconds, there was nothing. Then a reply came back, stronger than the outgoing signal, and the tower lights dimmed as if the building inhaled. Beacon 4 rebooted, then Beacon 6, then Beacon 2. Each reset exactly 41 seconds after the last. On radar, target smeared. A ferry icon jumped 190 meters toward the breakwater and held there. Over VHF, a pilot shouted, "I've lost range lights." Outside, the glowing circle tightened into a ring, and inside it, a darker shape began to rise. I felt the cycle lock onto my heartbeat hard now. Behind the tower glass, the sea outside began to glow in a perfect circle, expanding toward the harbor entrance like a countdown. The handshake didn't stabilize anything. It escalated. By noon the next day, every AIS dropout in the harbor happened on the same schedule. 41 seconds of clean data, 0.8 seconds of garbage, repeat. The pilots called it the stutter. They began steering by eye and by old habit, which is how you get superstition in a modern port. At 13:06, a coastal freighter named Lysa entered the outer channel in light fog. Speed 9.1 knots. The pilot reported his range lights breathing in and out. The electronic chart showed his target offset to port by 220 meters. He corrected, because that's what you do when instruments say you're wrong, and his bow swung toward the breakwater. I was in the tower when the alarm sounded. The raincoat man didn't move. Inez did. She grabbed the mic and ordered all traffic hold position. Too late. Lisa's starboard quarter scraped concrete with a sound that made my teeth hurt. It wasn't a catastrophic breach, but it was real damage. Paint stripped, steel scored, a minor fuel sheen spreading in a thin rainbow. No one died. That fact didn't comfort me. It only proved we had time left to fail worse. The official incident report should have been mine. Instead, I was told to stand down while a special team interviewed the pilot. I listened through the wall as they asked questions that had nothing to do with visibility and everything to do with what he'd heard on his headset. When he mentioned the clicks, the room went quiet. When he came out, his hands were shaking. "They made me sign something," he whispered. "They said my license depends on forgetting." Then he stared at the water. "Is it a submarine?" "If it were a submarine, it would be simpler," I said. Inez closed the outer channel for debris inspection. The press accepted debris. I walked the breakwater with a damage crew and a handheld IR thermometer. The concrete where Lisa scraped read 6.2 C, colder than surrounding sections, in a clean line, as if something under the water had chilled it from below. At the same time, my magnetometer logged spikes at the foot of the breakwater, plus 510 NT every 41 seconds, each lasting 0.8 seconds. The same stutter, only now it was coming from inside the harbor. Back at my desk, 3 copies of the launch recording stared at me like eyes. If I leaked them, the raincoat man would close the port and call it my fault. If I hid them, the next scrape might be a sink. I opened an anonymous post and pasted one screenshot. My finger hovered over send. The tower lights flickered once and I deleted the draft. In silence. In the aftermath, the raincoat man took control like he'd been waiting for permission. He issued orders to port security, redirected a tug, sealed the tower logs. When I tried to export the data, the black box on the network flashed red and denied the transfer. "Containment," he said. "We can't let amateurs weaponize half-truths." Inez cornered me on the stairwell. "This is becoming a crime scene," she said. "Not from the ship, from us." I showed her my own private map. The 10-meter steps from the knife, the spiral under Pier 9, the jump to Cinder Cove. I'd overlaid them on infrastructure layers, storm drains, sewer outfalls, service roads, fiber routes. The pattern wasn't just along the beach. It hugged interfaces, places where water meets human systems. "It's not hunting boats," I said. "It's testing access. It's learning how we move between land and sea." Inez swallowed. "Then what does it want?" I didn't know. But I had a hypothesis I hated. Mapping is what you do before you enter. At 2 o'clock that night, the lights appeared under the harbor itself, not outside. A chain of pale points lit beneath the quay, stepping from Pier 1 towards the fuel depot, 10 meters at a time. Every time they paused, a different streetlight above flickered in sync, like a response. I watched from my office window as the lights reached the storm drain that leads under Warehouse 7, the same storm drain that empties onto the service road. And then the drain cover began to lift millimeter by millimeter from beneath. At 2:17 UTC, the storm drain cover by Warehouse 7 lifted like a mouth testing its hinge. Not enough for anyone to notice at a glance. Maybe 3 millimeters, then it settled, then lifted again on the next 41-second cycle. I filmed it from behind a stack of pallets with my spare phone, the one that hadn't died on the knife. The audio picked up the 6 clicks through concrete, as if the harbor itself had teeth. I should have called Inez. I should have called anyone. Instead, I ran the numbers, because numbers are what I hide behind when panic tries to take the wheel. The drain is a 900 millimeter outfall tied into the service tunnel that runs under the quay. If something could push that cover, it could push farther. At 2:26, a forklift rolled past and the driver didn't see a thing. He was looking at his dash where the clock had jumped from 2:25 to 3:06 and back. His headlamp flickered once, exactly on the stutter, and he swore at the battery, blaming the only enemy he could name. I crept closer and laid the flux gate on the wet concrete. Baseline 47,230 NT. On the next cycle, it surged to 47,815 for 0.8 seconds, then returned, clean as a heartbeat. I pressed my palm to the drain cover. The metal felt numb through my glove, as if the sensation had been erased. Under my skin, my left hand tingled in sympathy, that same anesthetic crawl. A voice behind me said, "Step away." Raincoat man. He was less a person than a timing mark. 2 security guards stood with him, hands on belts, eyes fixed on my phone. "You've crossed from observation to interference," he said. "That makes you a liability." "It's coming into the harbor," I snapped. "This isn't a theory anymore." He glanced at the drain as it lifted again. "It's exploring. The correct response is controlled engagement. Controlled by who? I asked. By whoever can keep the city running, he said. Not by a man hiding drives in salt. One guard reached for my phone. I pulled it back too fast and the tingling in my arm flared into pain, a sharp line from wrist to elbow. I hated that my body had become part of the evidence. Inez arrived breathless, jacket thrown on over pajamas. She saw the lifted cover and went pale. "Close the fuel depot," she ordered, then turned to the raincoat man. "We shut down. Now." He shook his head once. "You'll do what you're told. The harbor stays open at minimum throughput." Inez looked at me, helpless rage in her eyes. In that moment, I understood the trap. If we shut down and nothing happens, we're hysterics. If we stay open and something happens, we're criminals. The drain cover lifted higher on the next cycle, 1 centimeter this time, and a line of cold light threaded through the seam. It wasn't reflection. It was emission. From inside the drain, water began to flow backward, uphill, as if pulled by a tide that didn't belong to the moon. The guards backed up. Even the raincoat man stopped smiling. I forced myself to narrate like a report. Temperature at the seam read 6.0 C on my IR gun, while the surrounding concrete was 12.4. The hydrophone caught the clicks, plus a thin tone near 27.6 kHz that made my teeth ache. My watch rebooted and came back 2 minutes fast. The raincoat man's deck of cards box flashed green, as if it had been waiting. "Open it," he said, and for the first time his voice carried something like hope. "No," Inez said. "We don't invite it in." That was the moral edge. Seal the drain and risk provoking it. Open it and give it a path. I hit record again, framing the seam, the streetlights, the raincoat man's face. If they erased the network, they would have to erase me. Inez grabbed my sleeve hard enough to bruise. "Nolan, if you leak this now, they'll come for you first," she whispered. I didn't answer. The drain answered for me, in a voice of metal and water. Then the light blinked 6 times, paused 1.2 seconds, and blinked again. Only now the pattern was mirrored in the streetlights above us, marching down the service road toward the city gate, and the first bolt holding the drain cover sheared with a sound like a gunshot. They sealed Warehouse 7 by 3:10. Port security threw a cordon across the service road and told dock crews it was a gas leak. The lie was almost elegant. Invisible danger, no questions. Inez bought us 30 minutes before the raincoat man arrived with his own tape and his own people. "Do not go inside," she told me, but her eyes said, "If you go, I will pretend I didn't see." I waited until the next 41-second cycle, when every streetlight blinked and the guards flinched like men hearing a cue. Then, I slipped through the side door into the service tunnel that runs under the quay. The tunnel is 2.2 meters wide, concrete with cable trays along the ceiling and ankle-deep runoff down the center channel. My headlamp beam jittered on the walls every time the click sounded, as if the light itself couldn't decide where to land. At 3:24, the first pulse hit me physically. Not a sound so much as pressure, a shove against the sternum. 6 clicks, pause, 6 clicks, then a lower vibration that made the rebar in the ceiling sing. My phone lost all bars. The spare phone stayed alive in its pouch, but the screen dimmed to half, like it was being drained from a distance. I followed the runoff to the outfall junction. There are 3 pipes, 600 mm to the storm system, 300 mm to a sump, and the 900 millimeter outfall to the sea. The outfall gate was supposed to be a one-way flap. It was open. Water was flowing in. It wasn't a surge from tide. The flow was steady, laminar, sliding along the bottom of the pipe like a conveyor. And inside the water, just beyond the lip, a cold light moved as if it had weight. I did what my job has trained me to do. I deployed a camera. Not a lab one, not a military one. A cheap inspection scope on a 10-meter cable, the kind plumbers use. I fed it into the pipe, counting marks with my thumb. At 3 meters, the video went grainy. At 5 meters, the image sharpened, impossibly, as if the water inside the pipe had become clearer than air. At 6.8 meters, the scope showed metal. A smooth curve pressed against the pipe wall, not scraping, not forcing, just present. The surface had no seams, but it was patterned with shallow dimples spaced 14 mm apart in a hex grid, like a material designed to control flow. Between the dimples, tiny points of light pulsed. 6, pause, 6, mirroring my audio. My left hand tingled. My tongue tasted like pennies. I wanted to pull the scope back and run. Instead, I pushed it another 20 centimeters. The metal rotated. For a fraction of a second, the camera saw around the curve into the space beyond the pipe. Not open sea, but a cavity lined with the same dimpled metal, like a throat made of machinery. And in that cavity, suspended in the water, was something pale and soft. Fabric, skin, caught on a protrusion, a reflective stripe. Rui's vest. My stomach turned cold. I had been telling myself he might have walked away, that people go missing for human reasons. The vest said otherwise. The vest said, "It takes what it studies." Behind me, footsteps splashed in the runoff. I killed my headlamp and pressed into a recess. The raincoat man's voice echoed off concrete. "He's in here," he said calmly, like confirming weather. "Bring the cutter." The cutter. Not to open the drain, to cut me out of my own tunnel. The clicks accelerated. The vibration in the ceiling shifted to a new rhythm, like a lock turning. In the pipe, the dimples brightened in a wave moving toward me, and the water level in the tunnel began to rise, not from behind, but from the pipe itself, as if the sea was about to pour straight into the city. I yanked the scope back until the camera head slapped the pipe lip. The vest didn't come with it. Something held it, gently, deliberately. On the screen, a chain of bubbles formed a straight line, then another, like a crude diagram. I crawled for the ladder up to Warehouse 7. Behind me, a portable saw whined, then choked. The pipe light surged forward and water hit my shins, cold and numbing. The raincoat man murmured, "It's choosing its entrance." My left hand refused to close. For seconds, they pumped the tunnel out by sunrise, but the water left a residue that glittered in the flashlight beam like ground graphite. The official story became unexpected backflow. The raincoat man's people installed a steel plate over the outfall junction and called it mitigation. I watched them bolt it down with 12 M16 anchors and felt a sick certainty. You don't bolt a door unless something is on the other side. Inez met me in her office at 9:30. She looked like she hadn't slept. "They're keeping minimum throughput," she said. 2 ferries per hour, cargo staggered. They think if they reduce motion, the interference calms. "It's not reacting to motion," I said. My voice surprised me with how flat it sounded. "It's reacting to interfaces, drains, ramps, cables." I spread my map across her desk. I'd rebuilt the light track from all my copies. Knife Headland Steps, Pier 9 Spiral, Cinder Cove Jump, the ring at the harbor entrance, the drain lift. Then, I overlaid infrastructure layers pulled from old planning PDFs. Storm outfalls, fiber routes, power conduits, freshwater intakes. The lights weren't random dots anymore. They were a checklist that ran along our weak seams. Every stop in the 10-meter pattern matched an access point within 3 meters. Every 2.4-nautical-mile segment ended near a drain cluster, and the biggest field spikes, over plus 700 NT, clustered around the pilot tower antenna after the handshake. We hadn't just been observed, we'd been incorporated. At 11:02, I listened to the hydrophone file again and noticed something I'd missed. Beneath the 6 clicks was a sub-pattern. The pause length wasn't always 1.2 seconds. It varied in tiny increments. 1 dot, 1.8 comma, 1.2, 1 comma, 1.16. Too small to be error, too deliberate to be chance. When I plotted the variations against time of night, the values matched tide height to within 0.05 meters. "It's syncing to our cycles," Inez said, reading my face. "It's using them," I corrected, "like a clock." The raincoat man called it 12:40. Not my office line, my personal. "You were in the tunnel," he said as if commenting on the weather. "Do it again, this time with us. We need eyes close to the interface." "I'm not your field tech," I said. "No," he agreed. "You're the person who understands patterns, and patterns are how you predict the next edge." He texted a schedule screenshot. Tonight's traffic plan, the times each vessel would cross the breakwater, the planned activation window for his equipment. They were going to transmit again. If they did, and the thing replied the way it had, we'd see another incident, only next time it might not be paint scraped off a hull. Inez and I argued for 15 minutes. She wanted to shut the port down completely for 24 hours. The raincoat man threatened to override her with national authority and implied she'd be arrested for economic sabotage. I wanted to leak the data before the second handshake, force the world to watch so they couldn't erase it. Then my own fear spoke. If I leak it, people will crowd the shore and it will learn faster. At 18 o'clock, the power flickered across the quay. Not out, just a dip, like a giant finger resting on the grid. My building UPS clicked on for 0.8 seconds and clicked off again, exactly on the stutter. The port's clocks reset back to January 1st, 2000 for the third time in 2 days. Time itself was becoming negotiable. Inez stood at the window and said, "We're going to lose control." I watched the outer channel camera feed. Under the water, a thin line of light formed, this time not parallel to shore, but perpendicular, pointing straight at the freshwater intake pipe that feeds the city treatment plant. The intake sits 1.9 kilometers offshore. If it got blocked or contaminated, the city would have 12 hours of buffer, maybe less. In winter, it's fatal. On my desk, my spare phone vibrated with 6 clicks. Pause, 6 clicks. Then a new sequence I'd never heard before, longer, almost like a word. And the raincoat man's black box indicator flipped from green to steady white, as if it had finally found the right address. At 21:30, the port ran at half dark. They dimmed the range lights to reduce interference, which is like whispering at a fire. The raincoat man's team set up in the pilot tower again with portable batteries and a new antenna array, 3 panels angled down toward the water like pedals. On his tablet, I saw the same map dot pulsing every 41 seconds, now centered on the city's freshwater intake line. "I'm not doing another handshake," Inez told him. Her voice shook, but she didn't back away. "You don't get veto power," he replied. "You get blame." Then he looked at me. "You're here because you want to stop accidents. Help us. Help us." The phrase was poison. Helping him meant accepting that secrecy was safety. Helping him meant letting Rui's vest become a footnote. I had a plan that felt like treason. Cut the tower transmission at the moment he keyed it, then flood the harbor VHF with a warning long enough for pilots to hold position. Not panic. Just stillness. If the thing was using our cycles, then breaking our rhythm might confuse it. At 22:05, I climbed the back stairwell to the breaker closet with a maintenance key I shouldn't have had. The panel was labeled in neat black print. Range lights, radar repeater, AIS feed, pilotage, network. I taped my phone to the inside of the door so it could record the clock and my hands, evidence again like talismans. Downstairs, the raincoat man began counting out loud. 5 cycles, he said, then transmit. My left hand tingled on cue. The building's fluorescent tubes flickered in 0.8-second hiccups. Somewhere below, the hydrophone picked up the 6 clicks, then a longer pattern that rose in pitch like a siren swallowing itself. At 1, I threw the AIS feed breaker. The tower went quiet in a way I'd never heard. No fan whine, no relay chatter, just wind. In my earpiece, pilots shouted as their screens went blank. I hit the transmit button on my handheld VHF and spoke into the chaos, voice steadier than I felt. "All traffic, this is navigation safety. Hold position, switch to visual bearings. Do not cross the breakwater." Inez took the mic from the tower console and echoed the command with her authority. For a moment, it worked. The harbor slowed. Engines idled. The city held its breath. The raincoat man's face went white with anger. "You just cut national infrastructure," he hissed. One of his guards lunged for me, but the lights under the water flared and he froze mid-step like a puppet whose strings had been yanked. Outside the tower windows, the sea at the harbor mouth lit into a perfect circle again, radius expanding at a steady 0.6 meters per second. Inside the circle, the water surface sank as if a giant bowl was being pressed down from below. Then the sphere rose. Not crashing through, not erupting. It lifted with impossible smoothness until a matte metallic dome broke the surface and held there, shedding no foam. The dimples I'd seen in the pipe were visible even from the tower, catching the harbor lights in a honeycomb sheen. The 6 clicks came through the air now, not just the hydrophone. They vibrated in my bones. The raincoat man stared like a believer seeing proof. A seam appeared across the dome, thin as a hair, then widened. The metal didn't open like a hatch. It unfolded like a flower, each segment peeling back in silence. Inside was not machinery. Inside was darkness, deeper than the night around it, and in that darkness, a second set of lights blinked in a pattern that matched my own heartbeat. Inez whispered, "Nolan, it's looking for a way in." My radio filled with voices. On the tower console, the intake flow meter jumped from 1.2 to 3.8 M3S backflow. The raincoat man seized my arm. "You don't understand what you've done," he said. I did. I'd chosen people over permission. The inner lights pulsed in 6s, but the pauses shifted. 1.18, 1.2, 1.16, like it was speaking in our tide language, and it was learning. And the storm drain network map on the raincoat man's tablet lit up, one node after another, like doors being unlocked from the seaside. The city didn't flood that night. Not because we won, but because the thing paused. When I cut the AIS feed, the harbor went blind. But blindness is survivable if you stop moving. The pilots held their vessels on engines and anchors, using horn blasts and handheld bearings like it was 1973. 2 ferries returned to berth. A tanker outside the breakwater spun slow in the current and waited. The accident I'd been afraid of didn't happen. The damage happened somewhere quieter. At 22:19, the treatment plant called the port. Intake pressure had dropped by 28%. The pumps were cavitating, pulling air like a drowning man. On the tower console, the flow meter pulsed in 41-second waves, as if the pipe itself had become a lung. The raincoat man shouted into his radio for containment teams to move to the intake gatehouse. Inez grabbed my shoulder and said, "If it learns that pipe, we lose the city." I had one piece of leverage left, my copies. Not just video, but the raw timings, the map overlays, the audit trail showing remote log deletion under my credentials. Proof that the interference and the cover-up were intertwined. If I let the raincoat man keep it all, he'd run the next engagement without scrutiny. If I released it carelessly, I'd feed a crowd to the shoreline. So I did the only thing that still felt like my job. I filed a report, just not to my supervisor. At 22:33, I used the spare phone's satellite text and sent a compressed bundle to 2 recipients I trusted to verify without sensationalizing: an ocean acoustics lab and a maritime safety board. I added one line: publish methods and timestamps, do not publish locations. The raincoat man saw me typing. His eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with calculation. "You think sunlight fixes this," he said. "Sunlight makes it worse." He signaled his guard. The guard moved, but Inez stepped between us with a harbor master's authority and a human's desperation. "Touch him, and you'll have to close the port yourself," she said. For the first time, the raincoat man hesitated. Outside, the sphere held at the surface like a black coin. Its open petals flexed once, almost imperceptibly, and the inner darkness drank the reflected city lights. The 6-click pattern changed into a long descending series, like a sigh. The tide chart on the wall fluttered as if someone had opened a door. Then the streetlights along the quay blinked in a wave moving inland drain by drain until the city gate lamps went out for exactly 0.8 seconds. In that brief darkness, I saw the true shape of the threat. Not a monster, not a craft, but a procedure. An algorithm in water and metal learning the edges of our systems the way a locksmith learns a door. The intake pressure stabilized at 2246. The backflow stopped. The sphere's petals folded back into a seamless dome. Without splash or wake, it sank straight down, taking its light with it, leaving only a smooth circle of calm water that lasted 41 seconds before the waves returned. By 1:10, the raincoat man was gone. So were 2 of the technicians. My access badge was deactivated. Inez was placed on administrative leave pending inquiry. The official report for the Lysa scrape listed fog and pilot error. Rui's name wasn't mentioned. At 4:12, exactly 1 month after the first drop, my encrypted drive in the bag of rock salt began to vibrate on its own. 6 clicks, pause, 6 clicks, coming through plastic, through wall, through bone. On the screen, a new coordinate string appeared as if typed by an invisible hand. 4305.2N, 844.9W. A point farther down the coast, away from the harbor, toward an unlit stretch of beach. A new edge. I packed one bag. I left my apartment key on the table, and before I walked out, I looked at the sea from my balcony and asked the only honest question left. If that was reconnaissance, what comes after the survey? If you want me to keep releasing the timing patterns without turning it into a feeding frenzy, hit like, follow, and tell me what you think the 6-click signature is: language, handshake, or countdown.